Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. We welcome back to the program today Katrina vanden Heuvel, executive or editorial director and publisher of The Nation magazine. Katrina, welcome back to Current Affairs.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, well, I really wish we didn't.
I don't think we've made much progress since we last spoke.
Well, I was looking back.
We spoke about the Ukrainian-Russian war.
I know. I was looking back through the transcript of our conversation that we had in 2022.
Wow.
And I realized that in that conversation, you were going through and you were explaining, the origins of the war, the need for a diplomatic solution to, and here we are. And I honestly, much of what you said to me could have been said here today in May of 2025.
Nathan, we spoke after the war began, after Russia launched the war. So we are now here, May 2025. Thousands of Ukrainian and Russian men, some women, have been killed in a war that is far more reminiscent of World War I, the mud, the trenches, block by block, as opposed to the war that has just been commemorated, the 80th anniversary of World War II. There is some diplomacy. President Biden did not talk to Putin for 3 years. That has been documented. And I find that criminal simply because both powers have nukes. Also, when you cut off relations, it goes down the pipeline. So there's no dialogue. President Trump, whatever one thinks, odious, toxic, vulgar.
We can do an hour just of the adjectives to describe
the adjectives. Has this perverse insight that it might be better to end a war than see more men killed. And he's, the stuff with Putin, Nathan, we've talked about that. The Putin puppet stuff is so tired. And, Putin is not a pussy. He's not being whipped around. He's holding out. Trump has walked away. Trump, who said he could solve the Ukrainian crisis in a day, 24 hours, has found that diplomacy often demands patience. I'm sure you know that it took 4.5 to 5 years for that illuminating figure, Henry Kissinger, and his Vietnamese counterpart to end the Vietnam War. But we are faced now with the two countries have met. the United States and Russia had dialogue May 15th in Istanbul. There's been a dialogue lower level between Russia, Ukraine. And that's important. There are a lot of people who are saying nothing's going to happen until Trump and Putin meet. There's summit seems off the agenda right now. But it is the case that summits often happen after the lower level diplomats have worked out what will be signed. So in any case, I just came back from Europe. I was there for 2 weeks. Lee Hochstadter, I don't know if you remember him. He's at the Washington Post, that benighted Bezos paper. I think David Ignatius, who's usually the foreign policy guy who gets a lot of whispering from the CIA and intelligence, has gone soft in the sense he sees the need for peace. So Lee Hochstadter writes, Europe's race to rearm is accelerating at warp speed and not nearly fast enough. In the face of mounting Russian...
Not nearly fast enough.
Well, what I saw when I was in Europe was that in the UK, in France, and in Germany, there is a narrative that if they don't rearm, they will be invaded. First, the Baltics, maybe Poland, will be invaded by Russia. So that is leading these countries to spend billions of dollars rearming, partly because they believe they can't depend on the United States, but partly because it's a military Keynesianism that they believe will create jobs. It certainly will create jobs in the United States if we continue. So I'm just saying there's this fear of Russia, the sense of an imminent threat that one doesn't even feel here. Obviously, it's the continent, it's different. But it's not leading to a smart politics. And it's not even leading to greater security for Ukraine because the battles go on and Russia is overwhelmingly hyper militarily armed. Last thing I'll say is that Ukraine has discovered drones. And, more important than the drones is U.S. intelligence, which I don't know where that sits or stands, but U.S. intelligence based on this 10,000-word New York Times article has been key to Ukrainian fighting and surviving.
there's a few things I want to ask you about in there. I was hoping you could help me a little better understand the Trump administration's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because every time I open the newspaper, and I think a lot of people probably have this experience, there is a kind of a paradox or contradiction in Donald Trump, where Donald Trump is a militarist one moment and a peacemaker the next. And one moment, Donald Trump will be on the record saying, we need to end this war immediately. I want to end it in 24 hours. We need to have negotiations. You don't get anything unless you're willing to talk to people. And I think, oh, thank God you understand that we need to talk to people in order to try and resolve conflict. And then I read today, Donald Trump says, actually, Putin's not serious about negotiations. We're going to wipe our hands of this. This is not our conflict. This has nothing to do with us. And Trump is considering pulling back and just not being involved with ending the war. Of course, in negotiations, this could be a feint. This could be something that you do in order. So help us a little better understand what your assessment is of what's really going on in Trump policy towards the Ukraine war.
Well, I mean, Nathan, I'm a person of humility. That's what's really going on.
Okay.
Let me try and take a stab at it. Excuse me.
Okay.
Very transactional. He is a deal maker. He's not a diplomat. And I think you see that in the way he gets impatient. Diplomats have patience. The Iran nuclear deal took 6-7 years to get to a point. But I do think he's tactical. He's transactional. He's a realist. He's not an internationalist by any measure, but he's not an isolationist either, because the United States is involved, mostly one-on-one, unipolar. But he's not pulled out of these countries. He certainly didn't pull out of Saudi Arabia. What he has pulled out of are the treaties. Treaties, by the way, were considered subversive in the Bush-Cheney years, too. But he's pulled out of Paris. He doesn't have any use for the acronyms of international engagement. He has no use for the UN, though many don't. But so I think that he's taking it case by case, and he's sending his emissaries. These are not trained diplomats. These are real estate
Yes,
heavies. In
it's golfing buddies.
But I agree that with Israel, it's just obscene. The idea of Gaza it's a genocide. It's not going to be a hotel place. But on Iran, there's schisms within his administration where he seems to be holding off and telling Israel, don't bomb Iran. We're going to try and work something out. So it's very tactical. It's very fractious, and it's transactional. And that's what I see. He's already gotten a deal, Nathan. And by the way, the most important way to move forward with Russia, and this has already been off the table, is no NATO membership in terms of Ukraine, the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. But look at Trump. He's already worked out a deal with Ukraine on mineral rights. And, he's trying to get away without paying for anything, like the reconstruction, his administration following on Biden's, wants to seize Russian oligarchical assets. Well, it's not a bad idea in terms of our oligarchical culture and society, but I guarantee you no one in the United States in Treasury is going to go for seizure of Russian assets if there's any parallel that could happen toward the United States oligarchs.
That may help explain a little bit some of these contradictions that we see. I mean, even on Israel, there are contradictions where one moment he's endorsing the kind of full ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and then also you read that Israel feels more abandoned by Donald Trump than they did by Biden, who was a genuine, true believer in Zionism, and Trump is willing to.
He was a patsy. Netanyahu pushed him over, rolled him over,
right?
And I think the Israelis, certainly Netanyahu and his close team, are surprised that Trump isn't giving them everything they want. But it's not a policy of compassion or peace, what's going on with Trump in Israel. The
Trump administration was willing to talk to Hamas directly, even though Israel didn't want them to. They worked out a deal with the Houthis without incorporating Israel. They're negotiating with Iran. Obviously, Trump's current tour of the Middle East, he's sort of cutting out Israel and disappointing them in 6 different ways. And they're saying, well, Joe Biden would have never done this to us.
But, Nathan, I think I missed a very, very important factor in Trump diplomacy. Money.
Yeah. For our listeners, Katrina just made the money fingers symbol.
Yeah. No, I really believe that there's an attempt to build his personal fortune as well as bring investment, so to speak, into this country. And he's having the dinner tonight with the crypto billionaires and investors. that directly enriches him. The idea that we used to talk about emoluments, which still is part of the scene,
How
in such
quaint.
innocent ways, is kind of mind-boggling. But there's no question that there's a money factor
Hmm.
in a lot of the dealings.
Yes, you give him a plane and he'll love you forever.
The Russia situation is still very, very dangerous. I mean, we forget about not only the nuclear weapons, but
Hmm.
they're going to be bringing nuclear reactors into Ukraine for electricity and other factors. And, there's an escalation factor that's still in play. And, Putin is viewed as a dictator, but he's kind of a referee between different schisms, different factions. There's a much more militaristic faction, which is somewhat based in these four regions in Ukraine, Kherson, Donbass. And Putin's not a peaceable person, but he's seeking a way to be part of the West. He's also seeking to be friends with China. But he could end up being enemies of the West and closer to China, which I think is geopolitically unfortunate.
One of the ways in which Trump is somewhat reassuring is that he does occasionally seem to have flashes of understanding of the danger that nuclear weapons pose to the world. He will say things like, oh, it's so terrible that we spend all this money on nuclear weapons. He even floated the possibility that the United States, Russia, and China should have some grand bargain to reduce their militaries by about 50%. But then, of course, he comes out with a proposal to massively increase the U.S. military budget, and his idea of, I think he calls it the Golden Dome, which is the equivalent of the Iron Dome for America, missile defense, that totally upsets the balance of nuclear deterrence.
But, Nathan, here's the deal. Remember Ronald Reagan?
Yes.
Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, 1986, with Mikhail Gorbachev, they nearly came to an abolitionist agreement.
Yeah, this is crazy. Yeah.
What happened to some extent was that Nancy didn't come with Ron, so he had to go home. If they'd had another day, there's a kind of belief, it's a myth, but a belief that they could have gotten a deal. But Reagan, remember SDI? He believed, based on movies, Hollywood movies and SDI. I do think that there is a discussion about restoring a broader U.S.-Russian relationship within a ceasefire peace negotiation. And there's talk, the last piece of scaffolding of the already weak disarmament work is up for renewal next year. Start 2. And if that's not renewed, it's very tough to rebuild arms control. The guy who really screwed it up was John Bolton, Mr. Frenemy of the first administration of Donald Trump, who under George W. abolished the anti-ballistic missile system. He's almost single-handedly. In any case, Reagan does have these weird flashes, but Trump, because they live in this is a reality show. This is cliched and not quite what he is, but he is a reality show person. If not reality show, Fox is a kind of reality show too. So he watches Fox and then he watches reality shows. And by the way, the obscenity that there's some reality show that's going to start. It's like what's it called? The Killing Fields or the Killing Game. Like if the winner gets a visa.
Oh, yeah. Their new immigration policy. Yeah.
But there is an arms control piece to this. If you can move to some ceasefire / agreement on Ukraine.
Well, the Quincy Institute, which you have been on the board of a long time, put out, I think, just yesterday, actually. There you go, the U.S. peace plan for Ukraine. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this because it strikes me that even if Trump has certain instincts that we ought to and have to play some role in the resolution of this conflict. As far as I understand it, the United States has not put forth like a grand peace plan like the one that the Quincy Institute is proposing, where they try and answer these questions of, well, what would this actually look like? What would you have to guarantee to each side? Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, the contours of what is being discussed. We don't know. We're not flies on the wall in these diplomatic negotiations. Hew fairly closely to what Quincy has put out in his summary statement. I mean, the fact that NATO is off the table. If someone is honest in a European government or elsewhere, they will admit to that. What's replaced it is accession to the European Union at some point. Then the boundaries, the issue of de jure front lines de jure acknowledging that Russia may have control of the Donbass. Then there's language, sensitivity toward language, etc. And then the big question of how you provide for Ukrainian security. The idea of Western forces until you can have more of a ceasefire where you could get forces from the UN via the UN or the global South. Reconstruction. The World Bank has estimated, Nathan, that reconstruction of Ukraine would take $1 trillion.
Mm.
The economy of Russia is militaristic and surviving, but they seek an end to or lifting of some sanctions. These are quid pro quo. But Ukraine, there's division in Ukraine. Zelensky represents the patriotism, the nationalism, but in honest, independent polls, a lot of Ukrainians would like to see a way forward out of this war. And security. Anatol Levin, who is, along with George Beebe, the key person on Eurasia, on Russia at Quincy, wrote a piece for The Nation yesterday. I mean, he's dismayed by the incoherence and militarism of the European countries. He does think that the United States needs to play a more important role if you're going to see a ceasefire toward an agreement. And at the moment, as you just said, Trump has washed his hands of it, so to speak. Didn't Rubio say he had little hands? His little hands, and walked away and said they're not playing, so that where that goes. But I think you are absolutely right. In diplomacy, there are feints and there's this, people walk out, they slam doors, you come back to it took a year, I think. I'm not old enough to remember exactly, to configure the table for the Vietnamese peace process, the shape of the table.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Right. With the shape of the table,
Literally.
deeply important, deeply symbolic significance. Yeah. Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today. Well, we spoke just last week on this program to Ambassador Chas Freeman, who I know you know well.
I admire him.
Yeah, very sensible guy, and an expert on all of the sort of major conflict zones in the world right now. Expert on China, Russia,
Saudi Arabia,
and the Middle East. So we talked to him about all three of those places. But I mean, he argues that over a course of decades there has been this kind of erosion of U.S. diplomacy. This kind of lost knowledge of what diplomacy even is. That has been bipartisan. And so, one of the reasons that, Trump may be a natural deal maker, but he is not a natural diplomat, which is an entirely different kind of lost art.
But, Nathan, that's a very interesting point. The ambassador I admire, who's kind of found his voice it used to be said in Russia that you became a dissident when you went on pension. Ambassador Matlock, who is Reagan's ambassador to the former Soviet Union, is a huge, he's a truth teller. He can't believe, and he is a diplomat par excellence. I think until recently, because Trump is kind of reviving this, kind of diplomacy was confused with appeasement and vice versa.
Definitely at the start of the war.
It's not understood as a process, which can be corrupted. But what is the alternative? The alternative is war. We overuse sanctions, by the way, but that is better than war. But 80% of the world is sanctioned in some way by the United States.
Well, actually, we discussed with Ambassador Freeman this question of, how the diplomacy was portrayed as being pro-Putin, when in fact everything that he was saying was that U.S. policy was hurting Ukraine, that Ukrainians were suffering, and what he was concerned with was the interests of the people of Ukraine. And we did an interview with Noam Chomsky in 2022, where his whole argument was the United States did not pursue diplomatic options that could have avoided the war, and we are not pursuing diplomatic options now. And the coverage of that interview was, essentially like Noam Chomsky calls for Ukraine to capitulate to Putin.
Talk about so this is true. It is the case that Russia invaded Ukraine. It is the case that there's a prehistory going back to 2013-14. Certainly NATO expansion should have been highlighted more, but Putin decided to do a kind of loopy Soviet Russian nationalism, traditionalism speech to precede NATO. But there's no question that it takes two to tango. And you could make the case of the United States' responsibility and Russia's responsibility. But I'll tell you, in Europe, it's interesting. The left, and I met with people from Die Linke, which is the former East German party. They're now in the parliament. They're divided. Some of them seek an end to the war. Others believe in solidarity with Ukraine. And that, there's been very little in this country, Nathan, you know that, of sensible discussion. You've had people on, I think they're sensible. But too often speech, as has happened during the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, others, if you say something reasonable, you can be equated with being, a Putinist, which is just a classic way to disable honest, real, rigorous debate. It
Yeah.
still goes on. I mean, the Democratic Party, sadly, and we were talking bipartisanship, the Quincy is considered transpartisan, which I like. But the Democratic Party has found, because Putin has been equated with Trump and vice versa, this negligent way, reckless way of equating anyone who talks about a way forward so that more thousands of men won't be killed as a Putinist, a Putin puppet.
Yeah.
Very dangerous.
I mean, in that first year, I believe it was the Congressional Progressive Caucus put out a letter that just said, we need to try and facilitate some kind of end to this war and pursue negotiations. And I think they were forced to withdraw the letter because, there was such immediate backlash to this.
The irony of that, I was in Washington that day. Just to backtrack for a minute, Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Caucus, had circulated that letter about 2 months earlier and had not gotten sign-off from a more recent letter, but not to go there, but to say that very night, Quincy and Acura, a group I'm involved with, the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, weirdly held a panel with Ambassador Matlock, 2 others on the Cuban Missile Crisis anniversary, which gave a sense of irony and eeriness to a discussion about how people shouldn't seek a diplomatic exit from Ukraine, but instead more militaristic. I think, Nathan, one of the problems is our policies have become so militarized. We sometimes have like the generals who come on TV, who basically don't even acknowledge what they own in defense stocks. But the conversations turn to military so quickly that there's not a sense of politics, history, or diplomacy.
I was just trying to look up something that was in the New York Times just about a few days ago, which was rather remarkable, which so there has been, since we last talked, a little bit of a shift, a little bit of an opening on discussion about the Russia-Ukraine war. But the New York Times ran an article on the war recently that stated, just as a fact, as a basic fact of the conflict, that the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO was so threatening to Moscow that it became one of the causes of the most devastating land war in generations. That's stated in a New York Times piece, and I remember that, people like you, people like Professor Chomsky, people like Ambassador Freeman, Ambassador Matlock were saying this in 2022, and this was considered a pro-Russian perspective.
It was considered out of bounds. Now, some of this, to be fair, when the war was launched, Putin didn't begin by geopolitics. He didn't begin with that. Like NATO expansion has been detrimental to security. He did do a whole thing about Ukraine and Russia and a history that is alien or not understood by many. So people fixed on that as opposed to what you just read. The most stunning article, Nathan, was an investigative 1-year project in the New York Times about a month ago. I think it was called The Intimate Relationship Between Ukraine and the United States. I mean, it was literally it opened in Ramstein, Germany, with American generals sitting with Ukrainian generals plotting the next moves, plotting intelligence moves. I mean, it was like, and that has to be extraordinarily threatening to a country like Russia, Soviet Union, which just marked 80th anniversary of World War II's end, where every family, not to politicize or weaponize this, every family lost someone. And you have NATO up to your borders. I mean, it's kind of like, what, why, what? And by the way, has NATO made us more secure? It began as a project by an arms dealer. I forget his name, but he had a project for NATO in 1997, and he worked Washington assiduously, and it moved. Some think it moved because Bill Clinton wanted to distract from his impeachment issues. Some believe that he wanted to expand because of the Poles and Baltic countries' constituencies in this country. And some believe that he was more militaristic because he hadn't served in the military and he made his first political move as don't ask, don't tell, which is important, but it alienated a lot of the military. So there are a lot of factors here, but I don't think it was security. Again, we come back to one of the ongoing issues of American life, not just America, money. That arms budget, defense budget has very little to do with security. If you got someone who worked in the Pentagon for 30 years, like Wheeler, I think Winslow Wheeler, or they would tell you it's much more about jobs and infrastructure. Years ago, there was a guy named Seymour Melman who laid out how you can convert jobs, military jobs, into productive health jobs, teaching. That's gone. I mean, that was the peace dividend, which was a term that was used, which sounds loopy now.
The idea that because the Cold War's over, maybe now we can fund some of the things that, might actually benefit people and not just new and more elaborate ways to commit or threaten to commit mass murder.
I mean, people were shocked. Anyway, there were many things shocking about Bush, Cheney, but going to war, an expensive war and cutting taxes for the richest, does it deja vu all over again?
Yeah.
But I do think you're going to see, I think you will see some resolution in the next, let's say we talk in 6 months. I suspect what we've witnessed over these last 2-3 years has been much more frozen than, now it could be much more dangerous moving forward, but it could begin to dial back.
Well, one of the encouraging things about the U.S. peace plan that the Quincy Institute has put out is that it doesn't seem utopian. It doesn't seem implausible. I mean, it goes through and it has some basic points that you could imagine, both parties accepting if it's in their interest to accept. I mean, it has no illusion about the fact that Russia would be reluctant to accept for example, what it proposes
Absolutely.
is freezing the conflict on current lines rather than what Russia's current demand is, which is that Ukraine withdraw from the territories that Russia claims and would like to assert sovereignty over.
Crimea, Nathan, is going to... I don't think that Quincy touches Crimea, which is likely to be a frozen conflict like Cyprus and Greece. Mm-hmm. Or others in the Balkans. But this is not a utopian pie in the sky memo. This is cold-eyed.
Yeah. Well, because it explains what the United States should be willing to offer each party in exchange for their agreement. And one of the things that it points out is that the United States, if we choose to use it, has immense leverage, immense power here. Enormous. To use U.S. power in order to get the parties to move from their current positions, right? So you can look at it and you could say, well, Ukraine and Russia are miles apart, but then you could say, well, but we are in this and we actually have things that we can offer each party.
And someone might say that's too transactional, Nathan, but that's the nature of diplomacy and give and take. And I think Quincy lays it out quite well. Yeah. The issue, though, of sanctions, for example, lifting some of the sanctions on Russia in exchange for... Lindsey Graham has a piece of legislation. I don't know if you've seen it. He introduced it, I believe, yesterday, to increase sanctions by 50%. Now, maybe that's a diplomatic tool, leverage, but it will demand in our system bringing along people who have, for the most part in the last few years, been, if not recalcitrant, opposed to any real move. So it's a different time. And I think it's gone on for so long. There are constituencies in both Russia and Ukraine, and people, first and foremost, who would like to see this war end.
I remember in 2022, around the time when we were first talking, the Carnegie Institute put out something that was very good that was about sanctions and saying one of the big problems with U.S. sanctions on Russia is that they don't come with descriptions of the conditions under which they would be lifted, right? So if you want to use sanctions as a tool to compel someone to do something, then you have to show them what the out is that they could get out of the sanctions. And if you don't do that, then they have no reason to alter their behavior.
So this was a Biden foreign policy move. To a large extent, the sanctions are punitive. They're not incitement to find a way out. There's no incentive system, as you might describe it. That's changing. And there is more talk about lifting some of the sanctions. But the process Quincy lays out, and Anatole Lieven wrote a piece for The Nation, which is very much what you just said, Nathan, which is the United States, I don't know if that means Donald Trump, has to play some role because Europe and the European Union is kind of incoherent right now. And they're concerned about, each country I mentioned, the UK Nigel Farage is leading in the polls to some extent after Starmer tried to go light on austerity. He's doing an austerity program mixed with kind of trying to compete with the right wing on immigration. And the same in Le Pen has been convicted of misusing European Union funds, but it's not clear what's going to happen there. And in Germany, the AfD received a lot of young votes and is doing quite well in the Bundestag. So it's a complicated scene. And above it all and around it all is this feeling of threat from Russia, which is widespread. Even the right-wing parties are not fighting. The only, quote, peace party is a party called Sarah Wagner, named for the leader who founded it. They did not make it into the parliament this time, but they say they're a peace party because they're for ending the war. On the other hand, their immigration politics is pretty hardline.
Well, I mean, we've touched on the fact that the encouraging thing about this is why I think people should go and look at the Quincy U.S. peace plan for Ukraine, is that the encouraging thing about it is that it does offer a realistic path away from war. And yeah, it also explains that it not only explains what the terms would be, it also explains what the process would be. I mean they put in a lot of effort to think very, very realistically about how something that is also not so unjust as to be unconscionable, right? Because one of the things that has been said a lot about diplomacy is, well, this would be deeply unfair to Ukraine, and they've tried to come up with something that is in fact
even-handed. I think it's even-handed. It takes into account Ukraine's security issues. It takes into account reconstruction. It takes into account language issues and the Donbass contested. So I think that they've really thought as diplomats. By the way, the Quincy Institute is founded partly because diplomacy has been so undervalued. And it's the idea is that war should be the very last resort, which is not the case in a lot of our discussions.
So as I say, the encouraging thing is that there's a path away from war. But I suppose we should conclude here with the warning, the danger. As you mentioned, you just came back from Europe, and one of the things that so disturbed you was this acceptance of as a basic incontrovertible fact, the fact that we have to increase our military spending. The Labour government in Britain has essentially said, "Oh, we're going to have to, we're going to have to accept cuts to social services because we have to increase military spending." And this is just sort of accepted as an ideological consensus. This move towards militarism.
What you see is that these countries are willing to spend a lot to fight what may be an illusory threat. The wrong lessons of history may seem to be listened to right now. It's not World War II. It's a different situation. And it's wrong to just fix on the idea that they're willing to spend a lot of money on armaments, and they're cutting the investment in people and social security, social welfare. Keir Starmer, I was at the Parliament in London when they opened debate on disability benefit cuts. 6 months earlier, Labour was defined by cutting subsidies for the elderly during the winter, heating subsidies. In my mind, that's not a winning, even-handed, fair, just program, but it's mounting.
And then one final point is that it's not just that there's something unconscionable about taking from the disabled to give to the arms industry. That's bad enough. But also that that militarism, increasing spending on arms, do not actually make us safer, because there's this phenomenon in international relations that is this is my number one most I wish everyone understood this, which is the security dilemma, which is the idea that all the things you do for your own supposed defense and self-protection, in fact, make you less protected, because what happens is that your adversary, your opponent, interprets what you see as a defensive move as an offensive move, and then responds through moves they see as defensive, but then you see as further offense.
But you know what also needs to be done, really fundamental, is redefining what security means. I mean, Olof Palme of Sweden, who would be weeping because his country's joined NATO, or Gorbachev, who gave an extraordinary speech in 1988 at the UN. Security is defined in military ways. Security is also dealing with, climate, with pandemics, with nuclear proliferation. Building up your arms doesn't necessarily equip you to deal with those security challenges. So, but we sound, that is what has shifted. And I don't know, it's worth a conversation with smart people as to, you have Chaz Freeman, how in his time has he seen it actually descend? We have a great poster at The Nation. It's called Political Descent. And I am a Roosevelt champion, not excessively, but it begins with Edward Sorel, the cartoonist. Roosevelt. We have to update it because I think Clinton and Dole are swimming like little wogs down here. But it's DESCENT, and I think we've had a descent of understanding about what security is.
Well, I do think that it is very, very difficult for ordinary people to keep their heads right. We're subjected to so much
Nathan,
propaganda.
No, sorry. Here's the deal. I think the establishment, Ukraine, I don't think is a project of people in this country, maybe constituencies of Ukrainians. But I think the elite, the establishment, has a language it talks to itself with, has understandings that they get filled with from college, from think tanks. Think tanks used to be think tanks. There's not a hell of a lot of thinking going on right now. They're shadow cabinets. Yeah. They repeat what happens in Washington. And if everyone's thinking the same, who's really thinking?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I just mean that we're constantly being pushed towards accepting new enemies, to be lapsing into war fever, and it's important to try and find voices of reason and sanity, which is why
I didn't mean to attack you.
No, I understand. I think we agree. Which is why I was going to build up to, which is why everyone needs to read The Nation, right? So, and
160 years old.
I was just going to, and then I was going to say congratulations, because you have just hit, we're hitting our 10th anniversary this year, and you are hitting your 160th anniversary, which is incredible.
Which I feel on most days. I feel 160.
All right. A light in the darkness for many years, a pretty good track record over this. Pretty good track record. When you look back at the 160 years, The Nation has probably been right a lot more than it's been wrong.
It's been wrong, but more right than wrong, but it's been wrong.
Yeah, you got a lot to be proud of, so we congratulate you on that. Katrina vanden Heuvel, thank you so much for returning to the program to speak.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs Magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs Podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.